Thank you for that nice introduction. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm not going to show you any slides. I don't have any pictures. And I'm actually going to read it. It's not very long, so I think I won't have any problem getting through it in 40 minutes. Valid arguments, even those with true premises, don't take you very far if you don't know whether the premises are true. The fact that I'm in Heidelberg doesn't give me a reason to believe I'm in Germany, unless I know, or at least I have some reason to believe, that I'm in Heidelberg. So why does everyone believe the cogito, I think, therefore I am, is such a great argument? Because, I suppose, everyone thinks he knows the premise is true. Everyone who thinks he thinks he knows he thinks. So everyone thinks his existence, at least his existence as a thinking being, is the conclusion of an irresistible argument. Now, the Cartesian inference is certainly valid. There's no question about that. And the premise is clearly true. At least it is for everyone who thinks it's true. I'm not questioning either of these claims. I do, however, think it worth pondering the question of whether, and if so, how, one knows that this premise is true. Granted that it's true, how do you know it's true? What reason do thinkers have for thinking they think? Is it simply the fact that they think? Clyde has cancer, but the fact that he has cancer doesn't give him a reason to believe he has cancer. Why then should the fact that he thinks give him a reason to think he thinks? There may be something about thinking, as opposed to having cancer, that automatically, as it were, provides one with a reason for thinking one is doing it. But if so, we need to know what this is. Is it perhaps because one can think one has cancer and be wrong, but one can't think one thinks and be wrong? Is it, in other words, because thinking one thinks is, as philosophers like to put it, though Descartes expressed it differently, a self-verifying thought? Unlike the thought that one has cancer, or a thought about almost any other topic, the thought that one thinks has to be true. Now, the thought that one thinks is self-verifying, no doubt about it. But having this self-verifying thought doesn't mean one has a reason to think one thinks, not unless one has a reason to think one has this self-verifying thought, or any other thought. Remember, our question is, what reason does one have for thinking one thinks? It's not an answer to say that if one thinks, one can't be wrong. That just leaves the question, what reason does one have for thinking one thinks? We're back to where we started, maybe even a little behind where we started. Now, according to certain austere theories of knowledge, I'm thinking of some versions of reliability theory, the fact that this thought, the thought that one thinks, is self-verifying means that one knows one thinks merely by believing one thinks. Beliefs that are perfectly reliable, according to this view, qualify as knowledge. There is, however, nothing in such theories that provide help in this, my current project. There's nothing in such theories that reveals what reasons one has for thinking one thinks. On the contrary, according to such Spartan views of knowledge, one can know that P is true while having absolutely no reason for thinking it's true, while in fact having reason to think it's false. What we're looking for here is something a little more satisfying, something a thinker has access to that would justify his or her confidence that he is a thinking being. We are, that is, looking for reasons, whether or not such reasons are deemed necessary for knowledge, according to certain frugal, and I would argue, implausible conceptions of knowledge. Now, we do enjoy a special kind of authority about what we think. Yes, I agree. But that should not be confused with authority about the fact that we think it. John Heil and Tyler Burge have argued, persuasively to my mind, that with respect to a certain limited class of thoughts, and they're thinking about currently conscious thoughts, we think whatever we think we think. We enjoy a kind of infallibility about what we think. This is so because in thinking I'm thinking P, I thereby think P, so I can't be wrong about it. It's like an exasperated mother saying to her misbehaving son, I'm telling you, Billy, stop pestering your sister. Mother can't really be wrong about what she says to her son. She tells him whatever she says she tells him, because in saying what she is telling him to do, she thereby tells him to do it. Even if the words mother utters, the words stop pestering your sister, mean by prior agreement between mother and son that he should get ready for bed, mother is still entirely correct in using the words stop pestering your sister to say what she is telling her son to do. She is, as she says she is, telling him to get ready for bed. So she can't be wrong, no matter what the words she uses mean. And the same is true for thought. There is no room for mistake at the second level, where you're thinking about what you're thinking. No matter what at the first level, you have to be thinking. That is, in what form or with what words in the language of thought. Now, if this is correct, if this is the way thought about currently conscious thoughts work, then we all enjoy a kind of infallibility in our thoughts about our currently conscious thoughts. But even if things do work this way, and I'm granting that they do, it doesn't help us understand what reasons we have for thinking we have thoughts, much less such infallible thoughts about what we think. If I think there's water in the glass, then if Burge and Heil are right, that must indeed be what I think. And if I think, that too must be what I think. But what tells me, what reasons do I have to think I actually have these foolproof thoughts about what I'm now thinking? The answer to that question is not answered by the infallible nature of the higher order thoughts about one's own thoughts. Mother does not have a reason to think she told her son to do X just because she knows that if she said, I'm telling you to do X, then she certainly did tell him to do X. Infallibility about what you think you are thinking and about what you say you are saying doesn't give you, not by itself, a reason to think you're thinking or saying anything whatsoever. Now, I'm going to return in a moment to this important difference between knowing what you think and knowing that you're thinking. But first, a reminder of just what I'm looking for. I'm looking for reasons S has for thinking S thinks that are not available to others. We're looking for facts that S has exclusive and therefore privileged access to that indicate or constitute evidence that S thinks. If S is a normal human being, we all have reasons to think he thinks. He has a PhD in physics, 43 publications, and he runs rings around us at the bridge table. Of course he thinks, probably better than we do. And there's no shortage of reasons for believing this to be so. And of course, S also has these reasons. Anything we can point to as an accomplishment symptomatic of S's intellectual powers are also available to S. If we have reasons for thinking S thinks, and we clearly do, so does S, exactly the same facts we have. That's not a question. I am not now questioning the fact that we all have thoughts. That's not the issue. The issue is the epistemological question of how do you know it? And in particular, if you know it of yourself, what special reasons do you have to think you think that I can't have? Of course, we, and therefore S, have reason to think S is a thinking being. What's in question is whether there are any facts that indicate this to be so that S has exclusive access to. Facts or conditions that S is aware of that we can't be aware of, at least not in the direct and authoritative way that S is. Is there anything S is aware of that others can't be aware of that gives S an evidential edge on questions about whether S have thoughts? Now, one way to proceed in an investigation of this sort is to look at how we learned we think. We all think before we ever discover what thinking is. Before we think we think. So at some point in time, or during some phase of childhood, we learned we think. How did we learn this? Who taught us? Parents? Did we take their word for it? Were we already aware of our own thoughts as we were of the dishwasher and television, and merely had to learn, as we did with ordinary household items, what to call them? Now, I'm going to look at that in some detail about how children learn this. But before I do, a word or two about just what I'm counting as thinking. Like Descartes, I mean to be pretty inclusive. Any description of a person that requires that person to think or be able to think, that's so-and-so, in the everyday sense of the word think, will be considered a form of thinking. This includes not only thinking in the everyday sense, when we say, I think someone's following me, but all the so-called, what philosophers call propositional attitudes, believing that P, judging that P, knowing, perceiving, seeing, hearing, and feeling, doubting, remembering, regretting, being sorry, hoping, intending, wanting, and imagining that so-and-so. Even pretending that so-and-so, that a banana is a telephone, for instance, which very young children can do, pretend, will count as a form of thinking on this broad construal. One doesn't, of course, have to think, not in the narrow everyday sense, that P, to wonder whether P, imagine that P, or pretend that P, but one cannot, not literally, doubt that P, wonder whether P, or imagine that P, or pretend that P, without being able to think that P. In this broad, inclusive sense, then, thinking is doing something that creatures lacking the capacity for thought can't do. Sensations, and here I'm thinking of pains, itches, tickles, hunger, thirst, emotions, anger and fear, moods, elation, depression, they don't qualify as thoughts, although these feelings and emotions and moods may well combine with thoughts to yield composite states that qualify as thoughts. I'm thinking of such things as anger that she left, or fear that he will fall. Those, I take it, are a combination of thought-like mental states with emotional states. I will continue to speak of one's reasons for thinking one thinks, but given this inclusive and broad understanding of what a thought is, our query could be put, what reasons, to which one has exclusive access, does one have for thinking one can think in the narrow, everyday sense of the word think? One final terminological matter before I address the problem. In speaking of thoughts, fears, perceptions, and so on, one can be speaking either of what one thinks, the content of the thought, or what is often called the act of thinking, that which distinguishes my thought that today is Wednesday from your thought that today is Wednesday. If we're both thinking that today is Wednesday, content of our thoughts is the same, but of course our act of thinking is different. I will always try to make it clear which I intend to be referring to when I talk about someone's thought. All right, with this understanding then, let's imagine a normal 3-year-old, I'll call her Sarah, who thinks, but hasn't yet learned that she thinks. That one thinks is something, psychologists tell us, that one only comes to fully understand around the age of 3 or maybe 4 years old. Sarah isn't quite there. She thinks Daddy is home. That is what she tells Mommy. That is why she runs to open the door when she hears a car pulling the driveway. What Sarah tells Mommy is, what else? What she thinks, what she knows, what she hears, that her father's home. She does not, however, think she thinks it. She may use the words think, know, or hear, in describing herself, but if she does, she doesn't yet fully understand that what she's giving expression to is a fact about herself, a subjective condition having a content, what it is she thinks, that may not actually be true. She will, however, soon acquire this knowledge. How and from whom? Well, no doubt from parents, teachers, older siblings, and friends. If one doesn't actually teach children this, if they merely absorb it in the way children acquire their native language, it is nonetheless from others, or at least with the help of others, that Sarah will learn that what she has been telling them is what she's been thinking, what she believes, what she sometimes even knows. It is from or with the help of other people, and perhaps from a few disappointed expectations, that she will learn that she has thoughts that usually depict the way things actually are, but sometimes fails to correspond to the facts. In the process, she will learn that her behavior, and of course the behavior of others, can be explained not only by the fact that her father is home, Sarah already understands that, but by the fact that she thinks her father is home. Something Sarah will learn that can exist in her and can explain her rush to the door without her father actually being home. As Jonathan Bennett once put it in describing what psychologists have learned about child development, a 2-year-old predicts and explains another person's behavior on the basis of what she, the child, thinks is true. A 4-year-old does so on the basis of what the other person thinks is true, or what the child thinks the other person thinks is true. To reach this level of sophistication at the age of 4, one has to understand, as 2-year-olds typically do not, what it means to think something's true. That is why normal 2-year-olds do not understand the behavior of someone who goes to the door when no one's at the door. A 4-year-old will understand this. The person went to the door because the person, but maybe not the 4-year-old, thought someone was at the door. To understand what kind of access we, those of us who think we have thoughts, have to our own thoughts, and thus what kind of reasons we have for thinking we have them, it's instructive to consider the kind of access Sarah, a person who doesn't think she has them, of course she doesn't think she doesn't have them either, has to her thoughts. I said above that Sarah told her mother that her father was home and rushed to open the door because she thought he was home. Now, it might not have been her father she heard pulling in the driveway, but Sarah thought it was, and the fact that she thought so explains why she behaved that way. If she had thought instead that it was the mailman, she wouldn't have told her mother that her father was home. She wouldn't have rushed to open the door. Sarah's thoughts and desires explain her behavior in exactly the same way our thoughts and desires explain ours. The only difference is that Sarah does not yet understand that her behavior can be explained by the fact that, whether or not her father is home, she thinks he's home. We do understand that. Now, if Sarah's behavior is to be explained by what she thinks, even when she doesn't realize she thinks it, and the behavior in question is a deliberate, purposeful act, that is, Sarah has and is prepared to give reasons for what she does. And these reasons are in part what she thinks. So if Mommy asked her, why did you say Daddy was home? Say, because Dad, she would say, because I thought Daddy. Because she doesn't understand what that means. She said, because Daddy is home. That's what she thinks. So she's prepared to give reasons for what she does, and these reasons are in part what she thinks. There must be a sense in which Sarah is aware of what she thinks, that her father is home, without being aware that this is something she thinks. Now, I'm going to call that form of awareness acquaintance. So Sarah is acquainted with what she thinks. Acquaintance is a form of awareness. Although this word, acquaintance, has a troubled philosophical history, I use it in its ordinary sense, the sense in which one can be acquainted with, in fact, good friends with, a philosopher, and not know he's a philosopher. One can be acquainted with, aware of, what was reported on the radio, that it is snowing in Miami, for instance, without knowing it was reported on the radio, that someone else tells you. So you're acquainted with what was reported on the radio without realizing that it was also reported on the radio. It is in this epistemologically uncommitted sense of awareness that Sarah is acquainted with what she thinks. She is aware. That is, she's conscious of what she's thinking in a way that doesn't require her to know or even think it's something she's thinking in order to be conscious of it. If she had thought instead that it was the mailman, she would have been acquainted with, aware of, conscious of something quite different. Something different would have been going through her mind, her consciousness, at the time she spoke to her mother. She would therefore have behaved differently. Now, what is it that Sarah is acquainted with, conscious of, when she thinks her father is home? We cannot say it is the fact that her father is home, because her father needn't be home for her to think he is home, and to behave in exactly the same way. Whatever she is acquainted with when she thinks he's home must therefore be logically independent of her father's actual whereabouts, in the same way that the thought that he's home is logically independent of his actual whereabouts. So it can't be the fact that her father is home. There may be no such facts. Nor can we say that what Sarah is acquainted with when she thinks her father is home is the fact that she thinks her father is home, because this is something she doesn't think. So, got lost? I'll read that over. Nor can we say that what Sarah is acquainted with when she thinks her father is home is the fact that she thinks her father is home, because although this, unlike her father being home, must be a fact, it is not a fact that Sarah, lacking the concept of thought, can be aware of. What then, if it isn't a fact, is it that Sarah is aware of when she thinks her father is home? Well, it's what philosophers have called a proposition. Propositions are the objects of thought. In thinking that her father is home, Sarah is acquainted with a proposition. The proposition that Daddy is home. Propositions are the meanings of those declarative sentences we use to express what one thinks or says. They can be either true or false. So what Sarah is acquainted with when she thinks her father is home is neither the fact that her father is home, nor the fact that she thinks her father is home, but the proposition that he is home. And that proposition may be false. That's just a way of saying, fancy way of saying, what Sarah thinks may not be true. Given the way we're understanding acquaintance, Sarah can be acquainted with this proposition without knowing it's a proposition. In the same way she can be acquainted with a philosopher and not know he's a philosopher. Now, if acquaintance with propositions sounds a bit strange, like some piece of philosophical hocus pocus, one has to remember that it's merely my way of saying that one can be aware of or conscious of what one thinks in the same way we, who know we think, can be aware of it without knowing that it's something one thinks. It's just a way of trying to describe the situation that Sarah's in. When she's aware of what she thinks, but isn't able to classify it as something she thinks because she doesn't have the concept of thought. Indeed, one way to describe the conceptual development of children is to say that what they learn at about the age of 4 is that what they have been taking to be what we call facts about the world are really what philosophers call propositions, entities that, unlike facts, can be false. Awareness of the proposition that her father is home does not mean, of course, that Sarah cannot also be aware of the fact that he's home. But awareness of facts requires more than awareness of propositions. It requires, in addition, awareness of the proposition that her father is home is true. All right, so there's a sense, a perfectly straightforward sense, in which one has a privileged awareness of one's own present conscious thoughts, even before one knows one has them. If we want to find out what Sarah thinks, Sarah is the authority about this. We have to ask her. She's the authority on what she thinks, despite not knowing she's thinking it. We cannot, to be sure, find out what Sarah thinks by asking her, what do you think? She won't understand what we're talking about. But there are indirect ways of getting the answer to this question. Given a cooperative child, we can ask Sarah whether her father is home, or why she's rushing to open the door. The answers will reveal quite unerringly what Sarah thinks. If Sarah wasn't aware of what she thinks, how could she know, and know furthermore with an obvious authority, the answers to these questions? Now, what this tells us is that the point of contact with our own thoughts is through their content, what it is we're thinking. We have a privileged and exclusive access to our own thoughts through acquaintance with their propositional contents. This mode of access gives our own acts of thought their peculiar diaphanous quality. The acts of thought are absolutely invisible to the person whose thoughts they are. Right now, you know what you're thinking, but you're not aware of the act of thinking. All one is aware of, at least up to the age of 3 or 4, is the content. Later, one becomes aware of the fact that this is the content of one's own thoughts. Something of this puzzling nature can perhaps be brought out by comparing thoughts, one's own thoughts, to verbal representations. People say things and they think things. One's access to what a person, and I mean to be included yourself, what a person says is through the person's act of saying it, an acoustic or observable event of some sort. We hear the person say he has a dental appointment, and then if we understand the language, we come to know, we become aware of what the person said, the proposition expressed. We go from saying to what is said, from act to content. In the case of thought, however, the route of access is exactly opposite. Our only point of contact with our own thoughts is through their content. Sarah thinks Daddy is home, that it's raining, that the dog is barking. Despite no awareness of the fact she thinks these things and no awareness of her own acts of thought, she is nonetheless fully aware of what she thinks, the content of these assorted thoughts. A few years later, Sarah will learn that there's something about or in her, something very personal. Everyone has their own thoughts, and private. One can keep one's thoughts to oneself, to which this propositional content is somehow attached. She first becomes aware of what she thinks, the proposition that her father is home, and later learns that this fact, or what she took to be a fact, was, so to speak, attached to her, but perhaps to no one else's thought. Unlike the fact that her father is home, it might even be false. Unlike a person saying, "Daddy is home," a verbal action one can be aware of without understanding what is being said, one can be, and at 2 years of age, one is acquainted with what one is thinking while having no awareness or understanding of the act of thought itself. The mode of access is completely reversed. That's what's unique about your own thoughts. Your only access to them is through your content. Every other proposition, what someone says and so on, your route of access is through the act of saying it. This mode of access to one's own thoughts continues, of course, after one finds out one thinks. One learns about the age of 4 that people, including oneself, have these privately accessible thoughts. One becomes aware that one thinks, but in learning this, one doesn't become aware of one's own thoughts in any way other than the way one was aware of them before one learned this. The access is still via their content. The phenomenology of thinking doesn't change at the age of 4. One doesn't suddenly, at the age of 4, become aware of one's own acts of thought. One simply becomes aware, learns, comes to believe that such acts of thought must exist somewhere inside one for a thinker to have thoughts she has, and to which each thinker has privileged access. Well, if this is indeed the mode of access we have to our own thoughts, doesn't this provide us with the answer to the question we've been struggling with? The question of what reasons do we have for thinking we think? The answer is everyone who thinks has a reason to believe he thinks because he is acquainted with a proposition, the content of his thought, which indicates the presence of the thought for which it is the content. So even a 3-year-old has reason to think they think. They just have to learn to use these reasons by learning to recognize as propositions, as the content of their own thoughts, the propositions they are and have been acquainted with all along. It's like learning at an early age that what one feels when hungry is in fact hungry. Since there's no special problem about what reasons we have for thinking we're hungry when we're hungry, there shouldn't be any special problem about what reasons we have for thinking we're thinking when we're thinking. It's the same story as about mom and dad teaching you, hey, you must feel hungry by now, you haven't eaten yet. Unfortunately, though, thinking is not like hunger. When you're hungry, there's something you're aware of. Something you feel that indicates you're hungry. You feel hungry. Even when you don't know it's hunger, you feel. You have to be taught. That's what you feel. When you think, though, there's nothing you're aware of, nothing you feel that indicates you're thinking. What you're aware of, what you're acquainted with when you're thinking are propositions. And propositions, unlike things you feel, do not indicate anything. Unlike facts, propositions can be false. And a false proposition does not increase the probability that anything else is true. False propositions are a dime a dozen. They're epistemically worthless. The proposition that pigs have wings, that's a perfectly respectable proposition. Something a person might actually think. has absolutely no probative value. It certainly isn't a reason to think that pigs can fly. If it were, we'd all have reason to think pigs can fly. What would be a reason to think that pigs can fly is if it were true that pigs have wings. If it were a fact that pigs have wings. Propositions, though, don't have to be true. They aren't facts. So Clyde's awareness of what he thinks, which is the proposition that pigs have wings, doesn't give him a reason to believe that pigs can fly. Even that pigs have wings. It doesn't give him a reason to believe anything. It certainly doesn't give him a reason to think that he thinks pigs have wings. And this is true even if what Clyde thinks is that he thinks. He needs a reason to think that this proposition is true in order to have a reason to think he thinks. And we're back to where we started, looking for reasons to think what thing. What this means is that there's nothing we're aware of in thinking that indicates that we're doing it, that we're thinking. We're aware of what we think, and we enjoy a privileged form of awareness of this content, yes, but thought content is evidentially worthless. Privileged awareness of it makes one an authority on what one thinks. Yes, in the same way Sarah is an authority on what she thinks. But it doesn't make one an authority on the question of whether or not one is thinking. And that's what we're looking for, that kind of authority. What then is one's reasons, one's evidence for thinking one thinks? If our mode of contact with our own thoughts doesn't give us a reason to think we're having these thoughts, what does? Obviously, I haven't found anything. At least nothing one has privileged access to, nothing one's neighbors and friends don't have equal access to. And since I can't think of anywhere else to look, I'm open to suggestions.